verses in verse 17 this week. When I turned to see who was speaking, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of those 7 lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe and a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like the flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice thundered like the mighty waves. He held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp two-edged sword came from his mouth. And his face was like the sun in all its brilliance. So we finished last week where John is basically taken in this vision, in the spirit, he says, and he sees this amazing vision of somebody who appears to be like the Son of Man, basically an image of Jesus Christ, but looking quite different as he's shining brightly. Pictures the idea as his hair is white like wool, or there's basically just this brightness, the glory of really heaven being revealed through Jesus Christ. And so that's what he sees, and then we pick up verse 17 is how he responds once he sees this. So I do need some readers for us. Who would like to read the first version, the ESV, Bart? And the second version, the New Living Translation, who would like to read that one here for us today? Jim? And the New Century Version, the third one, readers, any readers for that one today? All right, Caleb, let's go ahead here and read verse 17.
When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, "Fear not, I am the first and the last."
When I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and said, "Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last."
When I saw him, I fell down at his feet like a dead man. He put his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last."
Well, versions are almost identical on all of these versions here, as basically what happens when John sees this image of Jesus. He falls down as dead, it says. Basically, it's a picture of he faints. I mean, he's so overwhelmed by this vision, this image, the glory of God. What does this reveal to us about the awe and greatness of God?
Well, it certainly helps us understand in the Old Testament where God didn't allow anyone to look upon him because he just can't take it. So there's nothing in anything that can prepare us for his power.
Can you think of some Old Testament examples, or even Scripture examples, Old or New Testament, of people when they came into the presence of God and he showed them even just portion of his glory? Anybody have any other instances that come to their mind?
Oh, when Joshua was up on the mountain there, when he was on hallowed ground by the burning bush.
Okay, by the burning
God
bush.
gave him his tablets and then passed by, and Moses got to see his hindquarters or whatever.
Yeah, just a glimpse of that.
Yeah.
Karen?
I was gonna say when he passed by Moses, just
Yeah.
got the back of him, and then Moses actually, when he went down to Israel, he had to wear a veil because he glowed, and the Israelites couldn't even look at Moses from being exposed to God's glory.
So what you're going to say?
No, Joshua, when he was going to the promised land and he was met by God there.
Yeah, presence.
Daniel, he actually did what John did.
Yeah, Daniel faints
Flat.
when it comes to goes flat on his face. I think of one, Samson's parents. I don't know if you remember that one. Samson's parents, when they came into the presence of the angel of God, they thought for sure they're going to die because there's this glory. It's kind of like the idea of, if you've ever gone to and visited the Grand Canyon, and you don't go, my kids would jokingly, but you don't go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and say, wow, that's just a little small hole. You know, you look at this thing and you're like, wow. You know, you've seen pictures of it, but just the awe of it. You know, my kids would be more of the mocking type. They'd walk to the edge and say, oh, that's neat. And they'd walk away. type of idea is what they would do. But, you know, when you see something great, you're in awe of it. And in Scripture, whenever somebody comes to the presence of God or even partial presence of God, it's not like, oh, well, that's no big deal. It is, they fall down and faint. They're amazed. We think of the soldiers of the tomb of Jesus. What happens when the angel appears? Basically, they faint at the presence. I mean, these are strong, hardened warriors. Anyone in the presence of God, and it reminds us of the greatness of God compared to what we are as people. And I think it's important to realize that God can relate with us as humans, but we have to also be cautious that we're not constantly bringing God down to the level of man and comparing him to man. We're going to study even in Job this morning the greatness of God, and Job recognizes how far God is superior to man. Therefore, I love the fact that I can worship a God that is so much greater that I don't have to understand all of him. I can see this greatness, and here's what happens when Johnny falls down. But I love this response, and you see this response often whenever somebody goes to the presence of God. We think of the Christmas story, the shepherds, when the angels appear to them in the glory. What's the message delivered to them? The same message to John is what? Don't be afraid. Fear not. Yes, it is the presence of the glorious God. But don't be afraid, because I'm here to give you a message. And I love the fact he lays his right hand on you. It's this picture of comfort, this picture of strength. I mean, you think about it, how many times, if you've ever been around children or had to raise children, when a child cries, often what do they need to do? They just need somebody to pick them up, to love them, to care for them, to comfort them. Though I will say other times kids just need to say, hey, suck it up, let's go. You know, I mean, that's enough. Let's go. It's a balancing act. And that's really what God does sometimes. Is sometimes it's like, forget it, let's go. And other times he reaches out with the comfort and help.
And it's his right hand, which is the hand of judgment. And so with the gentleness of that, he's got that power of judgment in his hand, but he's saying, don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid of his judgment.
Back to the falling on his face before God. One day, every knee will bow, every tongue confess. I've always interpreted that as not being voluntary, like tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? So we'll voluntarily kneel before him. I don't think it's going to be voluntary. I think it's going to be, because of his awesomeness. Because you have no choice. Yeah. It's kind of funny because if you've ever seen something that's really magnificent and how the same people respond almost automatically to this. So I get this a lot because most of you know that when in the summertime, I don't do it in the winter, but in the summertime I love to climb the hill at the Scenic Drive. But when I do it, when there's a lot of people coming up, almost all the time when I reach the top, you will see people for the first time who come to that. And they all give this same awe response, and they just respond, and it's like this natural thing, like they're overwhelmed that this existed. And it's interesting because it's like an involuntary response to this because of the greatness and the presence of God. It's like, wow, this is so great, amazing. Yeah, God reaches down with John to provide this, even though he is strong in power and might and great. He says, hey, don't be afraid. Reaches down, and then he declares to them what? I'm the first and the last. What do you think he meant by that when he declares I'm the first and the last?
Maybe he was trying, if comforting, I'm still the same Jesus that you knew when on earth, because he was probably looking and thinking, wow, this is a different person. No, remember my love and kindness, it's still there. I still care about you just like I did when I was with you and walked with you.
Yeah, we talked last week here, you mentioned I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end, the first, the last. Basically, I think it's a picture of I'm in control. Don't worry, don't fear. I'm taking care of this. It's okay. This is me. I'll handle it. And I am the one who basically was around at the beginning. I am still around at the end. And I know this is so overwhelming and you're in awe, but you can trust me. And I think that's kind of this picture. The first and last is the idea of I'm taking care of things. I'm the one who's sovereign and in control. He continues to describe himself here in verse 18.
And the living one, I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades.
I'm the living one, I died, but look, I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave.
I am the one who lives. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys to death and to the place of the dead.
So what does Jesus declare about himself? He begins to say what? I am the living one. I'm alive. Now this is important. John did see him rise again. After he'd risen, John saw him go up into heaven. And here he's reminding us, look, I am the living one. And again, I want to emphasize this. We talk about this often, but this is one of the things that separates Jesus Christ from many of the false religions or people of worship that these prophets or these leaders of these religions have lived and died. Yet Jesus presents himself as I am the living one. He is still alive. He is working. He has this continued plan. Even though he died physically on this earth, but he's alive. And he basically said, I'm alive forever and ever. He's picturing the fact that we have eternity. Just as Jesus Christ, remember we talked about this the other week, that he was the first fruit. He was the example of what it's going to be to live forever and ever because he conquered this sin. So I'm alive forever and ever. And then he tells us what? That he has the keys to what? Death and Hades. Death and the grave. Basically, I have the ability to overcome death. I have the keys. Now, why is that so important that Jesus is the one who has the keys? Remember, Jesus declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Obviously, we all understand this. You need the key. I can't just take my key and go into any one of your vehicles and open it up and then turn the key and then to start it. I can't do that with my key. You have the key to yours, I have the key to mine. Jesus here, though, says, I am the one with the keys. I'm the one who has the ability to let people into eternal life. Steve?
Probably the significance of the keys in context was probably most doors in those days were just locked with a piece of wood from the inside. So somebody who held a key was somebody importance in a leading house, a royal palace.
Yeah, that's a great observation because keys would not be a very common thing for most everyone to have, but it would be this picture of somebody who does have importance because they carry these keys. So I'm the one with the keys, this opportunity to let you in. And this is a comfort. He says, fear not, understand, I'm the one who has access to this. So he's humbled by the greatness of God and his glory of what he sees. And Jesus says, look, don't be afraid because I'm the one who allows you to see this. I'm the one who will allow you to be here in this place.
Why do you think that he says it the way he did and focuses on death and Hades instead of saying, I have the keys to heaven?
That's a good question. I have the keys to death and Hades. And it could be a... Go ahead.
Well, one of the things I think that's important is, and it's the same today, probably the vast majority, they may have some nebulous idea of heaven, but a lot of people think death is it. That's the end, and Satan certainly wants to communicate that. That, living on earth, that's it. And that there is no eternity and all of that. So, you're not forever dead, which a lot of people would have thought. There was a lot of controversy over resurrection or eternal life.
Yeah, and I think it's a picture of, death is pictured basically as a trap, a grave, a cell, you would almost say. The holding place is basically you're dead, you're gone, but who can deliver us from death? who can deliver us, who can open the door to help us free from this death. And that's Jesus is the one, because he was the one that first came alive. So therefore, he broke the power of sin and death and opens that door. It's probably significance of that.
Well, the picture that we had of him before, everything seemed to show that he was a judge, all the aspects of his person. And so maybe he's also saying, I'm the sovereign over the afterlife. I'm going to be the one that will determine who goes where.
Yeah, great observations and understanding that Jesus is this one that holds the key. Then he turns to John and wants him to really, he's about to start giving a lot of information about what's going to happen. So verse 19.
Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are and those that are to take place after this.
Write down what you have seen, both the things that are now happening and the things that will happen.
So write the things you see, what is now and what will happen later.
So what is John told to write down? What he's about to see. So write these things that you have seen, so things you've already observed, and now things that you're going to see because they're going to take place. So he's recording what is currently happening, how he sees Jesus, the events that take place, but he also wants him to write down these future visions that are going to happen. So it's picturing now these things are going to take place in the future, and I want you to write these down because he speaks to the present, as we're going to see in chapters 2 and 3, the present condition of the churches of Revelation, but also speaking, he's going to continue talking about these future events that are going to take place.
I think it also communicates that these things need to be shared, and there needs to be an absolute record for future generations.
Yeah, these things are meant to be written down. Why? Because they need to be recorded so everyone can see. Now, remember we talked about last week or the week before, there's a blessing, a special blessing pronounced on those who read the book of Revelation out loud, those who listen, and those who obey it. So he needs to write it down. This was important. This was a message that was sent to all. And it's different because remember Paul. What happened when he went and had the vision of heaven? He basically said, there's things that I can't write down or record or I can't tell you about. There's things that are shut up that I can't see. And here, God says, look, there are things that I want you to see. Now, there are some things that God tells John that let's not put those. But other things, this is what I want you to know. So God is sending a message to us that he wants us to know these things about the future. Then verse 20.
As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
This is the meaning of the mystery of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand, and the 7 gold lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
Here is the secret of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, and the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches.
So what does Jesus say the 7 lampstands represent? They represent the 7 churches. And now he says the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. Now there's some debate on the angels. The term itself, the term angel in the Greek is basically that you have a messenger, normally referred to angels. Probably more in the picture here of, okay, these are the churches I'm sending this message to. And this is the messenger that carries these. Now we know that you're talking about 7 churches. There were 7 main churches. Now there's an emphasis on 7. And it's one of those things that here he says, okay, I'm going to give you the mystery. And he reveals some of the mystery, but there's still a lot of stuff that's mysterious about this. Exactly what is meant by the number 7. We know it's kind of the number of perfection. We're going to see some things, but there's still a lot of speculation. If you would read commentaries on Revelation, you have all types of different ideas. And so we want to stick really with what Jesus said. So he's defining here, okay, I'm writing specifically here to the 7 churches. Now, I'm going to say this, as we get into the 7 churches, I know he's writing to these specific churches, but we're going to see as he writes to each one of these churches in chapters 2 and 3, that they all have characteristics that we can see still existing in churches today. And almost like different types, I wouldn't even say types of churches, but different struggles that churches have today. And I think it's a picture not just to those specific churches, though it's a broad thing for all of us here today. And that's what we're going to get into here as it begins here in chapter 2, verse 1, as he starts to talk to the church in Ephesus. Go ahead.
To the angel of the church in Ephesus, write the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands.
Write this letter to the angel of the church in Ephesus. This is the message from the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands.
Write this to the angel of the church in Ephesus, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says this.
So I want to preface this because in chapters 2 and 3, if you're not familiar with the book of Revelation, chapter 1 is more of this description of who Jesus is, this presence of God, this overwhelming greatness, why he's writing the book. Chapters 2 and 3 are written specifically to these 7 different churches. Then in chapter 4 and on, it starts to go about future events. Now, many people, when they think of Revelation, automatically just think about future events, but there's significance of this. First of all, chapter 1, he's describing who he is and his character. I'm the first and the last. I'm the Alpha and the Omega. Now, chapter 2 and 3 says, okay, these are things that you need to do personally in your lives as a church, as a body of believers, because of these things that will take place. And I want to preface this. I think it's very important. There's a lot of prophecy seminars. There's a lot of talk about end times. And if you were to have, let's say, a prophecy seminar, you see it advertised, a lot of times people flock to those. Nothing wrong with those, but whenever you see prophecy talked about in the Bible, it's not just to be something that's either to cause fear or glory for the future. Almost every time it's given in Scripture, it has something to do with the way we live today. So here in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, he's telling us this is how we need to live today in light of all these things that are going to happen. Now, a lot of people will get caught up in all these what ifs, or what would happen, or I don't understand this, or started predicting things about the future. But to me, whenever I look at prophecy, I always want to take a step back and say, okay, what does God have for us today because of this? It's not just something that's out there, some neat sci-fi type of thing. It's how does God want me to live today, knowing that these things will take place. So chapters 2 and 3 specifically speaks to the church on how to live, knowing that he's going to declare all these things that are going to happen. So he begins with the church of Ephesus. Just to give you a little understanding here, Ephesus was one of the main churches in the area. It would have been one of the churches closest to Patmos at the time where John was. Most people would believe that John at that time was one of the leaders of the churches in Ephesus before he was exiled. And he describes himself here as the one who holds the 7 stars. We talked about that, the picture of the churches, the control of the churches. And he walks among the 7 lampstands, these messengers, so sending the truth of the word to the churches. Well, what do we know about Ephesus? One of the things we see is that it was right on the Mediterranean Sea, or the Aegean Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean. At that time, it was a very big port city. Interesting enough, if you go to Ephesus today, it's actually 3 miles, 2 to 3 miles from the sea itself, because the harbor has all silted in from the rivers that flowed through there. So it's no longer on Aegean Sea. Very interesting. Ephesus has tremendous ruins from Ephesus. It's one of the cities actually that was never really destroyed, but it was abandoned. The reason it was abandoned was because basically the mosquitoes got too bad. Is one of the big reasons, because the harbor started to silt in and created a swamp. And the swamp was right there, and it just brought in diseases and problems. The neat thing about that is it doesn't look great here, but compared to many places that have been basically destroyed and where excavations take place, Ephesus has some of the wonders of this. This is part of a library in Ephesus that was still standing, and these thousands of years later. It was known for this. This is a recreation of the temple to Diana, or the goddess Artemis. One was a Greek name, one was a Roman name. Here is a picture. She was the goddess of fertility. You've probably seen pictures of her image. We know about Ephesus. There was a large theater in Ephesus. If you remember, it was this very theater that they wanted to rush Paul in and then kill Paul there in Ephesus. And there's just a lot of things that go on. So Ephesus had a lot of biblical history. Paul was there for actually almost 3 years. And so they had a very strong foundation. We know that John was there. We also know that Timothy was there as a pastor. So they were a very strong church at one time. Because it was one of the churches that many of the apostles had gone through, been a part of. It was a wealthy city. And the church itself there was written to, even the book of the Bible was written to it. Timothy, when he was pastor with 1st and 2nd Timothy, it was written to him there in Ephesus. So Ephesus was a pretty big, important city. It's mentioned first. And here's how he describes the book of Ephesus, verse 2.
I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false.
You know all things you do. I have seen your hard work and your patient endurance. I know you don't tolerate evil people. You have examined the claims of those who say they are apostles but are not. You have discovered they are liars.
I know what you do, how you work hard and never give up. I know you do not put up with the false teachings of evil people. You have tested those who say they are apostles, but really are not, and you found they are liars.
So this church is commended for several things. There's really kind of 5 things here listed in the beginning of the verse here. Well, actually the whole verse. First of all, he says, I know your what? Your works. What do you think he meant by that? I know your works.
Good deeds, possibly.
Yeah, the things you do. You're active. You're doing things. You're doing good things. So I know your works. I know what you do. Along with that is your labor. In this picture of not only doing good things, but you work hard at what you do. Now this is great. God is commending them. Jesus is commending them for these things, indicating that these are things should be part of our lives as believers. So how we work hard for Him, we labor for Him. I notice your patience. The idea is that you are patiently enduring. Now this is something that's mentioned often in the New Testament. Why do you think patient endurance is mentioned throughout the New Testament over and over?
You're going to have to do it.
Yeah, you're going to have to do it. You're facing hard times. It's difficult. It's not easy. But you patiently endure. So they're commended for that.
Well, it's just a way to show to others and yourself that your faith is genuine.
Yeah, this patience and endurance. And he describes here is I know that you've examined the claims of the apostles, but are not. You've discovered they're liars. Basically, you have a hatred for evil. You don't tolerate evil people. And you're hard on false doctrine. And it's very interesting because this really is a definition of a lot of churches, especially churches that hold to the Word of God. I think back to the church that I grew up in. These things to me would be defining characteristics of the church that I grew up in. Because the fact is, we were taught all the time about working for God and working hard and being patient and hate evil around you, and you don't put up with false teaching or what you think is false doctrine. You're hard on that. And so these are very good things that the church is commended for. Some other things are commended for in verse 3.
I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary.
You have patiently suffered for me without quitting.
You have patience and suffered troubles for my name and have not given up.
So he not only tells them patient endurance, but now he really commends them for what? You're suffering. You're patient in this. This is hard. You're going through these trials. Now remember, as we talked about in the Bible, especially in the Roman Empire, there was varied amounts of suffering in different places. And varied amount of times. It all depends who was ruler at that time. Sometimes when one guy was ruler, things were well, and somebody else was ruler, it was really tough on believers. He goes, I know you've gone through this and you haven't quit. You haven't given up.
And it's not just suffering, it's suffering for his name.
Yeah, you're suffering for me and you haven't quit. You keep going. And I commend you for that. This is something, again, I want to point out to us. As believers in the United States, we really don't have to suffer that much for our faith. But this is something commended because it could be a time, it could come in our lifetime. There could be a time where we really have to face this, maybe, maybe not. There are people around the world who are facing severe suffering and severe persecution for their faith. And God reminds us over and over, I commend you for that, for those who are suffering. So this church, we would say, wow, this is an amazing church. This is something I want to be a part of. But then all of a sudden, we hit verse 4, and it's like this big understanding of, I have a problem. I was going to say big butt, but my kids talk to me about that over and over, about using that term big butt in church. And so he throws this in here. He says, look, I have all these things, but, verse 4.
But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first.
But I have this complaint against you. You don't love me or each other as you did at first.
But I have this against you. You have left the love you had in the beginning.
So what rebuke does he give to the Ephesian church? Lost your first love. You have all this stuff, but you're missing this love for me and for others. Now, how have you seen this? Maybe you've experienced it in life. How have you seen this happen in a church or in a spiritual life? That there are all these things, these wonderful things that exist, but then there's a lack of love.
Death of a child or a loved one.
Yeah.
Makes you question that.
Yeah, you question God's love, yeah.
Compromise. The world wants us to compromise. Put Christ's love aside and put more love to the temporary things of this world. Like this will give you happiness and that will give you happiness. You'll have joy forever. You know that's not true, spiritually speaking.
Yeah.
So compromising. Don't know if that's part of it.
The things of the world, yes.
And when you suffer, and you do it for a prolonged period of time, you start getting more self-focused and less likely to look outward and less likely to then be exemplifying the love of Christ.
Yeah, and you could get what's called, a martyr complex, the idea of, look at all the things I'm suffering. I'm doing all these things for God.
I think that, to me, this sounds exactly like a legalistic church. They're very strong on doctrine, but they're not so hot on, if anyone deviates even slightly out of that, what they have determined is the doctrine, the love is not there, at least for one another, which then, if you're not loving your fellow saints like you should, you're not really loving God like you should either.
Yes. Carrie, is that what you're going to say?
That's what I'd say, yeah.
Yeah. It's similar, it's that, and some of you have experienced, some of you haven't. I've experienced this a little bit, the understanding of a legalistic church, where what happens is everybody's always commended for what they do. All their labor, how hard of the work they are, how much they hate evil, and how much evil is so wicked around them. The problem is, what happens many times is you get so focused, it actually becomes very self-centered because it's all about me and how much I hate evil. And then what happens is it often transitions into hating people rather than hating evil. And now all of a sudden you lose a love for God because it's all about you and what you can do. And what happens is there's this great fear of God that's developed, but not the proper fear. Fear like I'm afraid, so you do everything because you're afraid God's going to hurt you or what God's going to do, and yet you're trying to be zealous, for God and do all these extra things you're doing, but it's easy to do it without a heart of love. Because we're commended even, often by what we do. We're congratulated by everything we see on the outside, but we miss love. Maybe you experience this in your own life, not even spiritually, but there's something at one time you loved to do, but then it started to become this burden, and you have to do it. The church I pastored in Wisconsin, one of the things that when I became pastor, I did something that was very controversial. I stopped a lot of programs that we had done for years and years and years and years. What had happened was somebody originally had started a plan, and they had a great idea. And it went well for a couple of years, but all of a sudden then that person passed away or wasn't able to do it, and somebody else felt like they had to do it, and then became this kind of tradition that you have to do. And everybody was struggling because they're all working so hard, but they were also miserable because they didn't love what they were doing. So wait a minute, we have to stop that because it's easy to do all these works, but miss out on a love for God and a love for others. And he says, look, I commend you because you're working so hard at what you do. But what does Jesus say about all the law and the prophets? You can hang them all on this commandment to love God, love others. That has to be the beginning of what we do, is love. Loving God, that's why I do this. I love others, so I'm going to show that. Instead, it's easy for a church to develop such a hatred for evil that we begin to hate everybody else who's not like us, rather than have a love for God and love for others.
I was just going to say, if love is your motivation, which it sounds like it wasn't anymore, that keeps the joy in it. It kind of sounds to me like this church was doing what they did with gritted teeth, plodding along because they had to, but there wasn't much joy in what they were doing for God because their motivation wasn't right.
Yeah.
And this was a charge God had had against his people for a long time. You see it in the Old Testament when he calls them out for not managing the poor and all that. And then Jesus called out the Pharisees because they were doing the letter of law. They were adding to it, obviously, too, but they had lost their love for who they were to shepherd.
We're going to continue this thought and finish up because I think it's important, and then finish the Church of Ephesus next week. But think about that this week. Think about the things that you do for Christ. Are they founded in this love? Not necessarily the passion. For instance, it was fun. Jen and I have been reading through. She found a journal that she wrote in college when her and I were starting to date. And it's interesting reading this. It was like we were like two little lovebirds, and she would talk about things and our conflicts and our good things. And we love each other differently than we did when we first started meeting. It's like a total different love. So it's not what it meant necessarily by this first love, like these high, intense feelings of falling in love, but it pictures something deeper. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more and go into that, and then finish the book of Ephesus next week.